I see on Facebook all the time stuff Pastor Jeff is posting about what's going on. Every time we connect, he's telling me stories about what the Spirit of God is doing in and through this church. And so I am so excited for you. And I'm just happy to be here this morning. Things got a little Pentecostal this morning, didn't they? I grew up in the Pentecostal church, so it's okay. I'm very okay with that. I'm very used to that, and I get it, so it's good. I've slept in a Pentecostal sanctuary many, many times. Last night might have been the first time I was actually supposed to fall asleep, though. When I was a little kid, my mom would bring me to Sunday evening service, and we'd sit over on this side. We had pews back then, not chairs, because pews were in. I heard pews are coming back, though. Like vintage, retro stuff is in, so pews are coming back. But we'd sit right over here. My mom would be right at the front. She was so hungry, so passionate. And I was probably like 2 years old, and so I would just be laid out here. We had those beautiful orange pews and the orange carpet. Anyone remember the orange? And so I'd be lying here snoring as the pastor's up there trying to preach his sermon. I feel terrible looking back, but anyway. We had a great time this weekend, and I love seeing the Spirit of God move. I'm going to try and talk really fast so that I can cram everything in, and I've told Pastor Jeff I'm going to keep it to 3 hours, so we'll be out by dinner. I do want to say I could go through all the stuff we brought with us. We've got a table out there, and it would take way too much time to go through the things that we actually brought and mention them specifically. But everything I brought, I don't get a penny from the sales, and it's just stuff that has personally impacted me. Everything you see on the table, I could tell you a story about how it's changed my life. And so, suffice to say that this morning's message is brought to you by BPEA and KCM. Please visit our resource table in the lobby. Okay? I'm not going to share the Christian pickup lines I learned this weekend, but you can talk to Nick if you want to hear some of those. He's a young single guy. He's not allowed to date, so if he uses any of these on any one of you, I want you to tell me, and I'm going to tell Sean. He's going to get kicked out of his mentorship, so stay away. Watch it, women. But I want to talk to you about the life of Peter this morning, just real quick. I identify a lot with Peter because Peter did some crazy things, and I think he was one of the most aggressive disciples, possibly the most aggressive. He was all or nothing. Peter did not have like a middle of the road. Peter did not have, a casual kind of faith. He was either jumping out of a boat into wavy water, or he was denying Jesus 3 times before the morning. It was one extreme or the other. And I feel like that a lot of the time, that I'm kind of that way. I have, one volume and it's shouting. I have one speed and it's fast, and that's it. And so I've gone through some of that. But we see in Peter, this was a guy who watched basically the entire ministry of Jesus and got such a good glimpse of who Jesus was. And I think we can learn a lot from Peter. I'm just going to skim over kind of some of who Peter was, and just to frame what it would have been like in his day and what his mindset would have been like, what his worldview would have been like. I don't want to take too much time because we do want to get out of here. We want to beat those Baptists. We got to get the chicken. So Peter grew up by the Sea of Galilee. He was a fisherman. His dad would have been a fisherman. His grandpa probably was a fisherman. You get the picture. He grew up on the water. He grew up in a kind of a mid-sized town. It wasn't a big city, but it was along a major highway, like 404 over here or 400 over there. So they'd have a lot of traffic going by, Roman soldiers going by all the time. And he would have grown up going to the synagogue. I talked this morning about how I grew up going to the Pentecostal church. Peter would have grown up going to church every Saturday because he's Jewish. He's not, Jesus hadn't come yet. We hadn't moved the day yet. But he would have come, he would have sat probably in the same spot every week. If a visitor had come and taken his seat, he probably would have, done the nice Christian thing and sat somewhere else. But every now and then during the sermon, just looked over and glared. What gives you the right? That's my seat. I paid for that seat. What are you doing over there? And he would have heard the same sermons, literally. It was like clockwork. Every year they go through the same bit of the Torah, same sermons, same stories, same words from God, and it was God's word, but there was nothing backing it up. He would go to church every week and he would hear the same story. He would hear about this living God, and yet he would see no evidence of that living God. Week after week after week, there was no demonstration. There was no power. And then one day, when Peter is probably about 20, in his early 20s, he comes to the synagogue. He's there with his mother-in-law who's sick. He's there with his family, with his wife. He's there with his friends, the people who he grew up with. All of them have done this year after year after year. Always the same tradition. And he comes, and this man is speaking, a man named Jesus from the area of Nazareth. And Jesus comes and he shares a message, but he doesn't just speak the words. Jesus, the Bible tells us, spoke with authority. And so when Jesus had finished preaching, he saw a demon-possessed man. And I'm not pointing at anyone in specific. Don't worry, don't freak out. I'm just... But he sees a demon-possessed man. And this man had probably had this demon for a long time. Probably everybody knew this man. They knew the manifestations that this demon would cause. They knew the problems that this demon would cause. They knew that this man's quality of life had been robbed from him, that he couldn't function in society normally because of the demonic oppression and possession in his life. And Jesus sees it, and unlike every other preacher they've ever seen, Jesus speaks to that demon, and he commands it to go, and the demon leaves. Jesus preached with authority like no one had ever seen before. You see, Peter grew up in a time where they had been waiting. They'd heard prophecies. They had them written down. You can still read them today in the Old Testament. They had prophecies in here about a Messiah that would come. They had heard it preached. They had heard it prophesied. They'd heard it spoken. And they'd waited thousands of years. They were living in a time when the Romans were oppressing the Jewish people, when there was harsh taxation, when freedoms were being taken away. And they were believing that a Messiah would come and deliver them. And year after year, they would hear these messages, these prophecies about this Messiah, and he wouldn't show up. And suddenly a man shows up who speaks with authority, a man who might just be that Messiah, a man who might just be the one to deliver Israel. He's there in Peter's city. He sees him in the flesh, not a distant God in stories in the Old Testament, a God right here, right now in front of him. And Jesus begins to minister in that city, in Capernaum. And it says they brought everyone who was sick to him. They went actually to Peter's mother-in-law's house. Peter says to him, "Come see my mother-in-law. She's sick. Can you pray for her?" And so Jesus comes and he prays for her. And she gets healed. And one by one, they bring sick people into that house. And every single one of them gets healed. Every single one of them gets touched. Jesus didn't look at them. He didn't look at how good they were. He didn't look at how well they'd lived their life. He didn't look at how well they'd obey the laws of the Torah. He didn't look at how often they went to the synagogue. He didn't look at what race or background they had. He didn't look at whether they were rich or poor. Jesus saw them sick and in need of a touch, and every single one of them he touched. That is the Jesus we're talking about this morning. That is the Jesus who wants to meet with you this morning. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what your life is like. It doesn't matter where you're coming from this morning. It doesn't matter what you did last night before the service. Jesus wants to meet with you. He doesn't discriminate against who he touches. He wants to touch every single one of you, and all you have to do is come to that house where Jesus is and say, "Jesus, I want to touch from you. Would you pray for me? Would you touch me? Would you heal me?" And Jesus will do it every single time. He hasn't changed since then. He's the same today as he was then. It doesn't matter what you need. He's going to touch you this morning. A couple other things that strike me about Peter. So Peter was a fisherman. And he was out fishing not long after Jesus had visited the synagogue. Peter's out fishing. And we can see the story in Luke chapter 4. I'm not going to read through it just for time's sake, but you can see the story there. I am preaching a sermon based on the Bible. That's good. You should check it out. Test me, see if I'm actually preaching the word. If I'm off, throw out what I said. This is a very good thing. We as Christians, we are called to be sheep, but we are sheep of the shepherd Jesus, not of anybody who gets a microphone in their hand. I don't know why I'm saying this, but I believe this is for some of us this morning. I am so frustrated at Christians who are the most gullible people on the planet. God has given us wisdom. Amen? Check it out in the Word. Don't believe every single teaching that comes. If it's not based on the Bible, I don't want it. If it's in the Bible, I want it. And I don't care what it looks like. I'm not going to judge it because it's different than what I'm used to. I want it as long as it's Bible and only if it's Bible. That is what we are about. Amen? So Peter's there in Luke chapter 4, and he's been fishing. And Jesus comes, and they've been fishing all night. And these guys knew how to fish. This has been his entire life. He'd been a fisherman. And they've worked hard all night, and they're tired, and they're exhausted, and they haven't caught anything. And Jesus comes, and he says to cast their nets over the other side. And we see something happens. They say, we've been out here all night, but nevertheless at your word. Because they knew what the word of Jesus was like. They'd seen him in their synagogue. They knew that his word carried power. And so they said, at your word, we'll cast our nets. And so they put them over the side, and they get more fish than they've ever caught. They have to call their friends in. The nets are starting to break. There are so many fish. They can't believe it. And so they get to shore. And Jesus, he calls them. He says to them, would you follow me? Because I want to make you fishers of men. He asks them to leave the life they've been living and come and follow him. Now, to give you perspective, this was not just a hobby fisherman. These are guys, this is their business. This is what they do. This is how they make their money, is they sell their fish. They sell it to the townspeople. They sell it to the people passing by on the highway. They sell fish. And they have just made the biggest business deal of their entire lives. They've caught more fish than they've ever caught. Let me tell you, this is like I'm a real estate agent and I sell houses, and I've been selling houses for, a few $100,000, $500,000, maybe if you're like, downtown Toronto, $1 million, but that's about the scope of my business. And suddenly I get a call and I've just sold a $100 million property. This is the biggest deal I've ever had. And so I've got the money there on the table. It's mine, my commission, the most I've ever made, most fish they'd ever had. And Jesus says, follow me. You know what they did? They left everything. They left the fish. They didn't sell them. They didn't pack them up and take them with them. They left them there, and they followed the call of Jesus. And, I'm not going to go into depth, but very, very briefly, I could personally be making more money than I'm making right now. I went to school for computer programming. I technically still have a business making websites. I have no interest in making websites. There's good money to be had, but all I want to do is follow the call of God on my life. And for me, that doesn't look like making websites. For some people, it is. It's not about whether you're behind a pulpit or whether you're sitting out there. What matters is, are you following the call of God on your life? And sometimes it looks like a sacrifice. Sometimes it's not the easiest decision to make. But let me tell you, it is the most fulfilling and rewarding thing you can ever experience to follow the call of Jesus. And you've got to give some stuff up. We talked about this morning, there was that word about throwing out the sandbags. And Jeff said, he's going to get into this later. But I was reminded this morning of probably about 8 years ago, Nick threw on a song in the car. He was our DJ on the way here. We had a little worship time. And he threw on something off of one of Hillsong United's Look to You CD, one of those songs. And it brought me right back, because that was probably the first worship album I ever owned. And I remember having my Discman, putting on anti-skip because, I would walk aggressively and it would shake and it would skip if I didn't. So I got my 90-second anti-skip on there. I got 90 seconds of shaking, and then I got to calm down because it starts to skip. And I had my headphones in, and I'd just walk around and I'd listen to this worship. And it was unlike any other music I'd ever listened to, because I had been into some really dark music in a lot of ways. I listened to punk and heavy music, and there were songs that I used to listen to, like Born to Die, and just these songs of absolute hopelessness, like really not very good. And those were the things I was letting into my spirit. And suddenly I had this worship CD that my pastor had given me. I just started going to church again. I'd left the church for a few years. The pastors gave me this CD and one other one. And listening to this music that spoke life over me instead of death. And I didn't even, I think, realize it at the time why I loved that CD. It wasn't just because it was good music, and it was. But it was because the way it made me feel. It made me feel life instead of death. And so I remember about a year later where, I'd gotten more into worship music and Christian music. And God told me to do something. He told me, throw out all of your secular music. Get rid of it all. I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm not saying there's something wrong with it, but that's what he spoke to me about. And when God speaks to you about it, you do it. And so I remember I took a garbage bag full of CDs, probably, I don't know, at least a couple $1,000s worth. I'd spent a lot of money buying these CDs. And I just said, I don't want them anymore. I don't want anything that's going to keep me from God. And so, God, at your word, I'm going to do it. And so I took them down to the beach. I had a little bonfire. I threw in all of my secular CDs. I threw in some Christian ones because I didn't realize they were saved until later. I had to rebuy them. But I just obeyed with all my heart what God was saying, you know? And that's what's important. You can see, Paul talks about how, and I forget the reference, but he says, you know, if in your heart it's sin, basically it's sin, you know, is kind of the synopsis of it. And it wasn't whether or not secular music was good or bad necessarily theologically. The thing was, in my heart, that had been a stronghold in my life. It had been something that had taken me away from God. And now, by giving that up, I was saying, God, I'm coming back fully to you, and I'm committing to you. That's what it was about. It was just about something God was doing in my heart, and it looks different for every single one of us. So I'm not trying to give you a blueprint here and saying, you know, everybody go, like, let's bring all of our secular music here. We'll have a big bonfire at the church tonight. We won't tell the fire department so they don't shut it down. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying to follow what God is saying specifically to you. And so Peter was willing to make the sacrifice, and he gets chosen as a disciple. And he walks with Jesus, and he begins to know Jesus. He sees how he ministers. He sees what his character is like, what his power is like, what his purposes are in the earth, what his love looks like, his grace. He gets to receive his fire. Peter had spent the time with the man. You can't know Jesus by just, you know, casually every now and then looking at the Bible, coming to a Sunday service every now and then. It takes time with him. And if you're not taking the time with him, then you're not going to be able to live a Christian life. I've tried to do it. You know, there was a time in my life where I had previously been really devoted to spending time with God. I'd started every single day with an hour of prayer and worship, just spending time in God's presence. I'd been very intentional. And it's not about a specific time, but I would encourage every one of you to take some time to set your eyes on Jesus every single morning. I was living in Toronto not too long ago, and right on Islington Avenue, right by the Gardner. So you have a picture where that is. That is a busy stretch of road. And we had a single-lane driveway with 3 cars, so we had to constantly shuffle in and out, which is a huge pain. But I was blessed. I'm in Toronto. I have a driveway. I don't have to pay for parking, so that's good. But one morning, we go out, and we have to shuffle all 3 cars. Mine has to go in the back, and my other friends has to come out. So I'm in the middle. There's a truck in front of me, my friend's car behind me. And so I get in the car, turn it on. You know, my friend Jeff, who's behind me, he pulls out, he goes, and so I start to back up. It's my turn to get out. So I'm backing up, and I'm looking to my right because it's Islington Avenue, and there's tons of traffic. It's a busy day, and so I want to keep an eye on the traffic there, and I want to, look for a space. So as soon as there's a space, I'm going to go, and I'm going to drive down the road. So I'm backing up, and my eyes are there, and all of a sudden, wham! I hit Jeff's car. He hadn't left the driveway. He was right behind me, but I wasn't looking behind me. I wasn't looking where the car was headed. I was looking down there. It is very dangerous to try and follow a path that your eyes aren't even on. It is very hard to follow Jesus if you aren't looking at him. That's why it's so important every morning to set your eyes on him, to set your gaze on him, to put your heart towards him every morning, even if it's 30 seconds, just saying, Jesus, I love you. Be with me today. Guide me today. Done. That's it. If that's all you have time for, that's fine. But just take the time to focus on him every single day. Because if you're not looking at him, if you're looking over there at all the stuff that's going on, all the busyness of your life, then you're going to run into trouble. And I got to a point where I was working at the church in Ottawa, and I had gotten so busy that I felt like I didn't have time to spend with Jesus every morning anymore. And I got distracted by all this stuff. And let me tell you, I ran into some big trouble. Very, very condensed version. I allowed the devil to gain some strongholds in my heart. I got offended at all kinds of things. I lost the passion that I'd had. And I wound up actually getting let go from the church. Bill sat me down one morning, it was a Monday morning, and it was a Tuesday. It had been a long weekend, so it's Tuesday morning. He sits me down, and he fires me. This is the bill I'm working for now. Fired me. And man, that sucked. That was a really, can I say crappy in church, Jeff? It's a really crappy morning. Oh, I'm sorry. Just edit that out of the tape. I did not say sucked. I would never say that. I don't know why you would accuse me of that. That is, I'm saved, people. Come on, I'm better than that. And so I thought the call of God on my life, I'd lost it. And you know, Peter, here's a guy who walked with Jesus. He walked on water. He knew the voice of God, and yet he denied Jesus 3 times. And he thinks it's over. And we see Peter, he's decided that he's missed it. He's decided that it's over. And so Peter has gone back fishing. You see it in John 21. You could read the story later. But he'd given up. He thought it's over. And he's out on the water and he's fishing. And he thinks this is it. Maybe that wasn't the Messiah. We thought everything was going to change. We thought we were going to have this revolution. We thought we'd receive the promise. But now, whether it was real or not, we've missed it. He's been killed. I've denied him. It's done. I screwed up too much. And they see a man on the shore as they're fishing. And he calls them in. And it's Jesus. And he invites them over. He sits down with them. And he feeds them. They eat together. Jesus welcomes them back. That's the grace of God. Let me tell you, I know the grace of God because I wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't for the grace of God. The number of mistakes I've made, the number of times I've messed up, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't even be alive today if it weren't for the grace of God. But because of that, I am able to now be walking again in the calling that God's placed on my life. If you feel like you've messed up, if you feel like you've made so many mistakes that you're just too far gone, let me tell you, the grace of God does not run out. Jesus' love, nothing can separate that from you. Romans 8 tells us absolutely nothing can separate you from the love of God. And so today, if you'll just go to the shore where Jesus is, if you'll sit down with him, if you'll dine with him, Jesus will show you his love, and he'll welcome you back with open arms, and he will launch you out into the calling you feel you lost, into the destiny you feel you've lost. Jesus doesn't care about the mistakes. All he cares is that you come running back to him because he loves you so much. And we see Peter welcomed back, and Jesus just asks him this simple question: do you love me? He asks him it 3 times. And Peter says, yes, every time. Just like he denied him 3 times. 3 times now, yes, I love you, Jesus. Yes, I love you. You know that I love you. And Jesus tells him, feed my sheep. In other words, Jesus is saying, you know how I told you a while ago that your name was Peter, and on this rock I'm going to build my church? You know how I said you were going to establish the church, the Christian church that we're now a part of today? You know how I prophesied that over you? You know how I gave you that destiny and I gave you that mandate? And you feel like you threw it away the night I was crucified? You feel like you gave it up and walked away from the call? Well, today I'm telling you, as you're telling me you love me, I'm saying welcome back. Welcome back to the calling. Welcome back to the destiny. Welcome back to the future that I gave you, because all I care about is that you love me and that you've come home. That's all he cares about. If you love him, if you come to him, all the other stuff, all the past doesn't matter. And today I'm working with Bill again. It's amazing, the restoration I've seen in my life. I'm traveling with him, and I'm being launched into ministry that I thought was dead. I thought it was over. I thought it was gone. I thought I'm just going to run this business doing programming. I'm going to be a fisherman the rest of my life. And yet here I am today. And God has restored everything, and it's better than it was before. That is the restoration of God. It's not just that he forgives you, it's that he brings you back, and it's better even than it was before. And so Peter had gone out ministering before. He'd seen the sick healed. But we see in the book of Acts, after receiving Holy Ghost, Peter is walking down the street and his shadow is healing people. There is so much increase with God. It just keeps getting better and better and better and better. There's no limit to how high you can go with God. And that's it. That's all I want you to get this morning, is to just keep going after him. So how'd I do?